Hello my friends, and welcome to the Curate's Study. Please come in and take a seat. It's great to spend some time with you again today in this, another of our Wondering Wednesdays. And today we are continuing a series of Wondering Wednesdays looking at the complex and sticky issue of suffering. And so last week we began considering or having a general conversation really with some thought-provoking questions and ideas as to why a good God might allow suffering and evil to exist. Now, as with last week's Wondering Wednesday, I want to start this with a health warning. I recognise that suffering is very much part of the human condition. I'm not immune to that, neither are those that I love. So it's entirely possible that as you watch this, that there is something happening in your life or the lives of those you love or around you that is causing you suffering of some sort. I cannot provide you with trite answers as to why that may be happening, and nothing I say is meant to detract from anything that you might be going through. As I say, this is a general conversation, but if you would like a pastoral conversation about what is happening to you, or if you would like prayer, please email me at fromthecuratesstudy@gmail.com, all in lowercase. So last week we started trying to define terms because I explained this is just such a broad conversation, and I'm attempting to précis it down into a few relatively short episodes of Wondering Wednesdays, that it's useful if we define terms. And also note that we're talking in very, very general, rounded terms as well. We aren't being incredibly specific, because if we are, this would go on for, well, quite some time. So last week we started talking about what we might mean by suffering. And I said today we would then examine what we might mean by evil. So what do we mean when we talk about evil? Well, many Christians might say, if we asked them to define evil, that was something, it would be something which God would object to, that would be against his nature or his character. Now I have to acknowledge at this point that is opening a whole can of worms, because if you've read the Old Testament, you will know that in the Old Testament God appears to command his followers to do some things which today we might consider to be objectionable, possibly even evil. And so when I talk about the nature and the character of God, if it's easier for you to imagine what I mean by that, for today, let's look at the nature and character of God as revealed by the ministry and life of Jesus Christ. That is one characterized by love and compassion. Now, before anybody pushes the heresy button and writes to the bishop, I am not suggesting for a moment that there is some dividing line between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. I'm not saying that at all. All I'm saying is, for the sake of an easier and simpler discussion, let's take that as our datum point for this particular series. We can look at apparent differences between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, if you imagine those exist, and I'm not saying that I do, but if you imagine those exist and you want to have a conversation about that, we could look at it in a future Wondering Wednesday. Now, it's easy to imagine, of course, that if you're an atheist, the situation about, as far as defining evil, becomes a little bit more tricky, because in reality then, of course, the word evil really is just a human construct, which more or less means a group of actions or things which at any given time the majority of a culture thinks are wrong, or would like to put in the box they mark evil. But of course we also have to acknowledge as Christians that much as we might like to claim that our views on what is evil are set in stone based on God's character, clearly that is not true, because Christians' concept of right and wrong, moral and immoral, good and evil have changed and will no doubt continue to change. If you want an easy example of that, we only have to think about those many centuries during which the act of slavery was condoned by many Christians who would use scripture to justify its existence. Possibly some of the very same scriptures that those who then condemned slavery as being barbaric used to condemn it. And I can't think of any Christians I know today who would argue that slavery is a good thing. So Christian views on good and evil have changed and will no doubt continue to change, just as secular or atheist views on good and evil have changed and will continue to change. And we also have to concede as Christians that if we are happy to make the accusation that in previous centuries gone by, church fathers were in error in their reading of Scripture and their interpretation of Scripture, which would be the only reason we could say that they'd claim to be able to use that same Scripture to justify slavery, we then have to concede the point that it might be the case that we too are sometimes in error with the way that we perceive Scripture, or the way or what we perceive Scripture to be telling us about any given situation. That, of course, is being human beings is less easy to concede. So here it's also worth noting that it's easy to confuse good and evil with legal and illegal, and the two are not necessarily the same, but it's something that's quite common today. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it is quite possible to imagine things that would be legal and possibly evil, or illegal and possibly not evil. So if you want an example of that, one could imagine civil disobedience, which would be classified under a legal system as illegal, but actually might be quite a moral and right result of an injustice, for example, civil disobedience for some particular political cause. Conversely speaking, I can think of the activities off the top of my head, possibly by a number of very, very large multinational companies, which actually under international law are legal, but I would say are quite probably immoral, bordering on evil. I'm not going to go into specifics, but I'm sure if you imagine the activities of some large multinational companies, you can imagine the same, can't you? So it's tricky, isn't it? And this is before we even start thinking if it is the act that is evil, or if sometimes a person committing an evil act can also be evil. It's also becomes even more complicated if we imagine that sometimes an innocent person can commit an act which results in evil. Or in fact, if the reverse is true, so that a good person can do a good act which results in evil. So, drawing us back to the question in hand, why might a good God allow evil and suffering to occur? Theologians and philosophers would roughly split evil into two categories. Moral evil, best thought of as the evil that we do, that human beings do, and natural evil, which would be the evil that sort of just happens to us. Now I stress, I'm paraphrasing massively here for the sake of making this digestible. So, but to give you some examples, moral evil would be things like murder, for example, rape, child abuse, all kinds of different violent acts. The list is lengthy, as I'm sure you can imagine. Natural evil might be the virus, the C19 virus that is currently plaguing the world. It might be an earthquake or a tsunami, something of that nature. So what have we discovered? Well, we've discovered, as if we needed reminding, that the topic of evil, trying to define what evil is as complicated as trying to get our heads around the idea of perhaps what suffering is. And we haven't even really got to the meat and potatoes of the question yet as to why a good God might allow suffering and evil. That I think maybe we will touch upon that next week. I don't know about you, but I've had enough evil for one Wednesday. So next week, in the imaginatively named The Problem of Suffering and Evil Part 3, we will get to the real question, or we'll begin to examine the real question. We might have to go on for perhaps another couple of episodes after that just to top and tail it completely. But I hope you've enjoyed that, a little jaunt through the world of what evil might be, what it possibly isn't. And next week we'll broaden our conversation out some more. So until we meet again, my friends, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. God bless.